Michael. So I'd like to invite the panelists to take their seats here in the front. And Camille is circulating in the room. She's sharing note cards where you can write down your questions so that we can pose questions from the audience to the panel. And thanks a lot to all the panelists. These were great talks and great overview of what's happening not only here in the United States but in the rest of the world too in terms of privacy and surveillance. And a lot of these, and also the keynote speech that we heard earlier today, and the talks that the panelists delivered, we focus a lot on problems. We know that now there's a lot of problems. There are new technologies that the government is using. Also what third-party corporations are using too for surveillance. So now in the panel, I'd like to start moving towards solutions, like hearing more about how could we solve these problems. Many of you touched those solutions already. So the first question I'd like to ask from our panelists: how should we regulate in an ideal world privacy in public spaces where we have surveillance cameras by companies, by governments? What should be my basic rights as a citizen to try to prevent myself from being exposed to something that I shouldn't be exposed to? Could we start from Jennifer Lynch?
Well, I think it depends on what country you're living in, and I can only speak to what's going on in the United States. But unfortunately, I think we're at a disadvantage as citizens because a lot of these camera systems are already set up. And even though many of them are not sophisticated in the sense that they are running facial recognition or back-end video analytics, the fact that the cameras are already in place does put us at a disadvantage because we've accepted that the cameras are there. So we're already playing catch-up. That said, I think that we can craft laws and regulations that place limitations on what kind of technology could be placed on the back end, and especially on how long the data is stored for. So we've seen this a little bit with license plate camera systems where, for example, in Los Angeles, they already have about 300 license plate camera equipped police cars just in the LAPD. And they're collecting thousands of plates every minute and storing that data from 2 years to 5 years. And with that data, it's possible to track a person as they're going through their lives and place them in a specific location, a specific time, and a specific day. But that information is much less revealing if you don't have it for 2 years. If the agency is only allowed to keep the data for a week or 2 weeks, it's much less privacy invasive. So I think this is one place where we could start. If we're talking about systems that are already in place, we can place limitations on how long the data is stored for.
Thanks. Great. Jennifer, do you want to continue?
Yeah, I'm mostly just agreeing with Jennifer and myself. When we both worked at the Samuelson Law, Technology, and Public Policy Clinic, and when we did the San Francisco study, we spent some time coming up with model guidelines. And it is amazing how few municipalities or other public organizations in the U.S. have any guidelines around video surveillance in particular. And so that might seem weak to people because it's just, guidelines, but really it's something, and generally at least it gives you some kind of legal foothold there. And what we saw in San Francisco, for instance, was that San Francisco had such a tight set of guidelines that it actually almost made the tools difficult for the police officers to use in order to investigate crimes. I don't think that's what the city had intended, but they were actually written in such a way that it really actually made it difficult as an investigatory tool. But in general, what I saw in the work I did were a lot of, especially medium to smaller sized police departments trying to adopt this technology, and a lot of them have no technological expertise whatsoever, so they are easy marks for or equipment salespeople, and they often overbuy and then they don't know what to do with it. But really, yeah, there's this sense that they just, because they often don't have the expertise, they just keep it as long as they possible, and they don't train anybody, and they grab one person off a beat and say, hey, you can sit and do these cameras, right? Or they get volunteers from the community in some cases, which has its real there's some real problems actually with that. And so there's just a lot of, I think, over-optimism often with law enforcement when they adopt these systems. And they think it's going to be really simple and it's going to solve all their problems, and then they end up getting into a huge can of worms with it. And having guidelines actually really helps kind of establish the boundaries around which they operate, and at least allows them to have some kind of responsible use policy. And again, it was just amazing to us when we did this work, and this was already over 5 years ago, how few cities and departments had ever actually thought through some of these issues. So I think at least starting there is something.
Great, thanks. Michael, do you want to add to
I
this?
can briefly to that. I think you guys both highlighted an important issue, which is that oftentimes law enforcement doesn't have a clear understanding of the impact of the tools that they want to use. They see technology, as Reagan mentioned earlier, in this kind of technical positivism conception where by having additional cameras, by having the latest and greatest, again, taking advantage of by equipment makers, puts them in a position where they feel compelled to rely on this technology, this technical wizardry, and kind of forgetting about the kind of human-to-human interaction that at least at one point in time was central to law enforcement. And it was at least somewhat heartening to see the new mayor in New York kind of push back on some of those policies, specifically in bringing brand new police recruits from the police academy to high-risk communities where they are kind of conditioned into thinking that everyone's a drug dealer and everyone is, a criminal, and instead kind of bringing it back to the original strategy of local law enforcement where, they would have like a partner in a low-risk area, and they would understand that, 95% of law enforcement and policing is like giving directions, and helping out in medical emergencies.
So more thoughtful policies, guidelines. Should those policies be on like federal level, like law? So what would be like enough, like strong enough enforcement? What do you think, Reagan?
Yeah, thank you. That was going to be exactly my point. Jennifer had mentioned guidelines, and I mean, what comes to my mind is also laws, setting down a baseline standard for what should be protected and the capabilities of law enforcement. And I think when we're talking about this surveillance issues, it really comes down to, especially in an international context, when different regions have very different approaches to laws and legislations. If you look at privacy legislation, for instance, in the EU, it's much more of a comprehensive legislative approach that does lay down some kind of baseline standard. But in the US, it's more of a patchwork of different layers of laws and not one overarching comprehensive law. So then it really comes down to the collection side and the use, and which side do we want to regulate, and where do we put, or not regulate, but control in a way, and how do we do that? And I think in the EU there is certainly a baseline standard around law enforcement. It's not as good as it could be, and it's certainly not uniform across the entire continent. But there are rules, for instance, on profiling. When you have this data, what can you do with it, and what kind of decisions are you able to make based on this data that you've collected? And so not just letting machines make decisions, having to have a human interact with this data is one way to provide a better safeguard. And then also on the better policies and better laws is inclusivity. And this is something that we've just seen in this bad surveillance policy making scene, there's very little, not only public discourse, but also including security experts into consultation processes, civil society groups that actually represent the views of citizens, consumer groups, and really having different people involved in the policy making process to really think about what will happen once this law is in place, instead of just collecting everything and figuring it out later.
Thanks. That's really fascinating. So following up on that note, is there any place in the world, any country that has good policies in place or more advanced policies that we could actually, take as examples, or we as researchers and academia would look oh, that's more of an ideal situation, for instance, in Europe or somewhere else?
For surveillance, nothing really comes to mind.
We have to fix
honest.
that.
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was, and I would if anyone does know, that please do let me know. At the moment, there is no real ideal situation. But if we go back to this collection versus use and look at the corporate side, which does play a significant role in the surveillance ecosystem, then there are different approaches that are ideal for certain contexts. So, for instance, in the EU, there is a comprehensive reform that's happening over data protection. And data protection is all of the information that relates to you. And in the EU, this is recognized as a fundamental human right. So you also have the right to private life and the protection of your information. And so they are about to pass in the next few months, actually, a comprehensive regulation. That will be one law for the entire continent. That will give individuals much more control over their information, including the right to erasure, to portability. But it will also regulate companies and governments, all of those who collect data, to collect less data, to practice much better, like I said, data hygiene. So implementing things like privacy by design, where privacy is in the mentality, in the DNA of companies, in the technologies, but also in the practices and the policies. But this may not be the most ideal situation everywhere. I know in the United States it's maybe not the best approach, and perhaps you guys can speak to that. But for us, that is really in the EU context, this laying down this baseline standard does help reduce the risk associated with mass surveillance, because it does reduce the data and gives people more control over it.
Do you want to, any of you, comment on the corporate side? The regulation for corporate, data gathering and managing?
I think in the United States, we have less regulation of corporate gathering of data for a few different reasons. But one of them is actually, surprisingly to many people, based on the First Amendment. So in the United States, corporations are treated like people, and they have free speech rights, just like people have free speech rights. And so some of the proposals to limit the gathering of data have come up against free speech rights of corporations. So, for example, Jennifer talked about an article that was just in the Boston Globe about private companies collecting license plate data. And there are a few of these companies in the United States, and they've collected billions of plates of data. And Massachusetts right now is trying to pass a law that would ban the collection and the retention of this data by private companies. And the companies have pushed back. They've also pushed back in Utah on a similar law. And their main argument is, well, the First Amendment protects our right to take a picture of your license plate. And if you think about it, if you really break it down, if you don't think about it like mass surveillance, but instead think about it as taking a picture, we wouldn't want to prevent journalists from taking a picture of a plate that's out in public, because there might be a very good reason why that journalist is taking a picture of that plate, or just a person. So I think that these arguments are difficult to address, and it makes it difficult for the United States to place limitations on corporate data collection.
And just to go off of that, I think one of the issues that this belies is the movement towards private contractors that collect this data for government entities. And so you end up having this relationship where instead of citizenry being able to, through FOIA requests or otherwise get information and transparency from the government, which is compelled to at least attempt to have some type of interaction with the citizenry, instead you have these private corporations having this data, and it becomes much more difficult for users to have or citizens to have any idea about what's being collected, how it's being collected, and have any type of input into that process.
Great, thanks. Let's take the first audience question. So if you want to pose a question to the panel, please write it down in a note. And Camille will circulate around, and Chris is circulating around, collecting those notes. So the first question from the audience is the following. What is the role of regulation or technology innovation or social norms around consumer facial recognition tools? Basically, how should we approach consumer facial recognition tools that are becoming more common, like in regulation, and the social norms around it?
I can take this. So right now the Department of Commerce is doing a working group on facial recognition, commercial facial recognition technology, and addressing these very issues of what kind of regulations should we place on the collection of facial recognition data. And what the Department of Commerce is trying to do is to come up with a set of guidelines or principles that companies will agree to. But I think the problem is that with guidelines and principles, even if companies agree to them, there are still going to be certain bad actors. I call them bad actors because I think they're collecting too much data, but they are going to say that they're improving their business model by collecting that data. And the companies that are going to sign on are companies we already know are collecting our data, like Facebook. For the facial recognition context, Facebook, Google. And the companies that may not sign on are some of the loss prevention industry, which is stores will contract with a private company that puts in surveillance cameras into the store and tracks the faces of everybody who comes into that store. Again, we run into First Amendment problems. We run into property problems where companies will argue, well, I have the right to control what happens in my private space inside my store, or I have the right to take a picture just like anybody else has that right. So hopefully some of this will be addressed with the process in the Department of Commerce, but I think, again, it's something that's a very challenging thing, and it's something that we are all worried about because facial recognition can capture your image remotely without your knowledge and identify you without your knowledge.
Just on the social norms piece, I think critically it's a question of opt-in. And somebody might be able to correct me. With Facebook's current facial recognition rollout, I do not remember if it was opt-in or opt-out.
It's opt-out
right?
in the United
Yeah.
States, and it does not exist in Europe
Yeah.
or Canada.
Well, and I think if you look at a lot of, I'm going to point the finger at Facebook for a minute, a lot of how Facebook has rolled out features is entirely push as hard as they can and get you to opt out, which I think is a really backwards way of doing things. If you want to use facial recognition, then maybe you should have that choice, but at least allow you to opt in instead of forcing it down your throats would be my kind of question about the social norm aspect of it.
I think the challenge with that, though, is that, so what some of the stores will say is, well, we put up a sign in our store that said you're being watched by video surveillance and you're continuing to shop in our store, so you've opted in.
You consented, yeah.
Yeah.
But Facebook also has that in their policies, and everything is basically opt-in. They're continuously changing the privacy settings to be less privacy secure, and sometimes they tell you. They'll say, hey, we changed our terms of service. Take a look at our 250-page document that you can't read or understand, but it's there. And therefore, we have checked our box that says you have been notified, and therefore you have checked the consent checklist by either consenting or just not leaving the service, which I guess implies that you're okay with what just happened. And that's the unfortunate situation. But I did want to pick up on something that Jennifer brought up about the known companies. We're always talking about Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft. Did I appropriately mention the big ones? But there is a big question about the unknowns, and that's the issue with facial recognition technology, but also other forms of surveillance techniques is whose hands will it fall into, and what will be done with it, tomorrow or next year or in 5 years. And this, the Facebook facial recognition was blocked in the EU, but there are certainly a lot of other projects. I mentioned Indect, and a few other research projects that are testing out surveillance techniques. So it's very unclear as to what will actually happen with this research. This project, in particular, Indect, will not be deployed in the EU, and there was a big kind of protest about this, and they said, hey, we have the Charter of Fundamental Rights, there's privacy, all of this stuff. Don't worry, we're just doing research. But will this research project be copied and pasted and put into cities across China, where there is no such thing as a fundamental, Charter of Fundamental Rights, or other regions of the world where there aren't such stringent civil liberties frameworks? So that's the problem there.
Thanks. So now if we think about following up that point about research, we are here in academia. We are trying to do our best in studying the notion of privacy and monitoring and surveillance. And at the same time, we are encouraging citizen participation for democratic processes online, like crowdsourced policymaking, different types of online tools for activating citizens for participation. And oftentimes those happen on open online platforms where anybody can go and type in their comment and express their opinion, and if we think that's positive, that's great. But how about how should we, as researchers, think about data privacy policies? How should we communicate those to people who participate in these type of projects? And also then, how should we think about keeping the data? We have a great question from the audience here asking that, is there value to keeping data in a safe repository for an X number of years, for instance, 50 to 100 years, for scholars in the future, historians, sociologists, economists, and so on? Does privacy extend past your own lifetime? How should we communicate all these possible implications that participation on our online platform might cause to the participant?
That for me? The academic?
Yeah, well, you can start. Yeah, you're struggling with the same issues, I'm sure.
There's the irony of being a privacy researcher. I need your data in order to study you. Really, it is part of the irony of when you do privacy research is, I have to have something to study. And so, at Berkeley, clearly we are governed by our institutional review board, the IRB, which can often make it really difficult to do, especially something online. Because if I have done a survey online that I have to attach an IRB notice to, and the IRB notices are maybe the one thing that's more user unfriendly than a privacy policy. It's difficult. So, but I have to say, as a privacy researcher, I'm grateful for the process because I am at least cognizant of the risks, and I feel like when I go through the IRB process, they are forcing a lot of people who aren't on the same page as I am to think through these issues. And at least at Berkeley, they are very specific. Where are you physically keeping your data? Is it going to be online, or is it going to be on a hard drive, sitting in a locked office or in a file cabinet? You have to actually go through those iterations and discuss what you're doing and disclose that all in your IRB. But that's Berkeley, and I don't know how universal that is at other campuses. We're kind of notoriously, I think, hard to get through, or at least labyrinthine to get through when you go through the process. And I think it's good because I think that especially if you are a younger grad student and doing research and you haven't ever thought of any of these issues, you need to think about them. So I'm kind of as much as it can be a lot of overhead for me doing my research, I'm completely in favor of it. And one of the things we are asked is, how long do you intend to keep your data for? And it's a good thing for us to have to sit there and stop and think through, which reminds me, I have data I should probably actually go through and delete. But that's maybe the weakness. I have to remember it for my own research study. All the things I'm doing in the world, I am personally responsible for doing it. So it's, I think it's a little dicey in that it's kind of dependent on, in my case, me as a researcher, my ethics and my responsibility to go through and take care of it, and remember post facto to go back and get rid of stuff. But I think it's a good responsibility that we have. And clearly we need to be cognizant of it when we are asking people for data to participate in our research. Is that what you're...
Can I just follow up on that? Yeah. So I think this feeds into a point that was mentioned earlier about the difference between policies and then the implementation, like the technical implementation of those. So you can definitely have a policy that says, we respect your privacy, we're not going to collect your data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as told to us by an IRB. But then in terms of that actual implementation of when that user is interacting with your website or whatever, ensuring that is actually secure, and that data cannot be, some third party cannot have access to that data while it's being transmitted, et cetera. So like, for instance, we've worked with international organizations that have done surveys on journalists, on their digital security, and ensuring that process itself of that survey is capable of being done in an anonymous fashion. Instead of just saying, we will anonymize your data, you can ensure from the get-go that there's no way for it not to be anonymized.
We'll put it in a Google Doc.
Exactly. So it's that type of dichotomy and trying to think through to that final implementation to ensure that user has the opportunity or the knowledge or the choice to actually do it in an anonymous fashion.
Yeah, this is a really touchy part of the, data protection and privacy versus research, but also, medical research as well. And in the data protection reform process, this was one of the more controversial aspects. And there are, and there should be, exceptions for, the use of information to conduct research. But the question is, can you guarantee ever that a database will not be compromised? And in the age of big data, when you can just pick and choose, pieces of information that may not even be private information, this is almost always enough to identify an individual. So is it even possible to say, don't worry, we'll anonymize all of the information, or even pseudonymize it? And is that enough? And how do you build in those guarantees?
So like a great example, I think we're all aware of is, I think it was like 2006 or so, AOL, shared for academia, the millions of searches that had happened on AOL for, the research community writ large. And what was discovered was, even though they had anonymized the data as far as they understood, it was actually relatively simple to discover who was behind the searches, and there were lots of interesting stories about grandmas searching for, specific...
it was just two journalists.
It was a New York Times reporter.
Yeah.
Here we go.
And they found her address, they found who she was based on 3 months of searches.
But just to finish the earlier question, could we keep things for 50 years? I think that was part of the question. I think, there are times when that might be legitimate, but, I need to disclose it to you as a researcher that I may want to keep that around for that long. And as it is, we... In the Berkeley process, we actually have to say we will destroy the data after X amount of years, and that's all in our upfront and our notice that we have people read.
Thanks. So then we have a really practical question from the audience. It's about a situation that somebody takes a picture of me, for instance, and I'm not on Facebook, but then that somebody goes and posts my picture on Facebook. I don't even maybe know that it's there, but at least she or he posts it without my consent. So how could I go about trying to deleting that picture, or what are the policies around that? What could I do about it?
I think that nobody wants to hear the answer to that question.
Just say it.
So you can't interact with Facebook unless you have a Facebook account. I mean, in terms of being able to take your picture down. So you have to buy into the system in order to get your picture down. And it's unlikely that Facebook would even take that picture down because in the hypothetical that was written, the other person took the picture, so they have a first. They have a copyright to the picture, but they also have the First Amendment right to that picture. And your right to privacy is very limited in that context. You'd have to show that maybe that if the facts were different, if you were naked in the picture, or if you were seen doing something horrible in the picture, or if it were presented in a way that was false about you, perhaps you would have some rights. But Facebook is also protecting the rights of its user to post a picture that they've taken. And that's the fact pattern and the outcome in the United States. I think it may be very different in other countries.
And then even if you were able to finally convince Facebook to remove that picture, one of the great things about Facebook is it just marks that as deleted so that you don't have access to that, but Facebook still keeps the picture. So, you know, they're still gathering that data, even if you no longer want to have that data shared with you.
Yeah, Facebook owns that data.
Right, so there are like layers in visibility, even though we didn't see that anymore online, it's there.
Yeah, and there's
kind
a
of
great
creepy.
documentary called Terms and Conditions May Apply
Okay.
that you should
But
check out.
yeah, Facebook data, a lot of it is protected as a trade secret, and that's all of our information that they've claimed as their own, and that's an intellectual property right of theirs.
So the last question before wrapping up. So now, what should we do, and what could we do as citizens? This is also an audience question to actually improve privacy policies. For instance, one idea that came to my mind, I'm from Finland originally, and we have really strict like hygiene policies that came to my mind when Michael and Reagan were talking about data hygiene as a notion, that should we start certifying companies and maybe even governments, like based on their policies, like, you know, if you were, you know, practicing really good policies and you would be very hygienic with your data management, so you would get a certification and that would be visible online or something like that. We have that in Finland for restaurants, like there are inspectors that go around and then there is a stamp you see when the restaurant has been inspected, so I can see as a citizen whether the food there is healthy and what are the improvements that they have been assigned to do. Would that be possible? What could we do and what should we do as citizens? Should we demand something like that?
Well, we've already had
there are
systems.
privacy seals.
Yeah.
There are privacy
They
seals.
just
They
don't
haven't worked. They haven't been effective. I think in the restaurant context, you have clear standards of what makes a restaurant hygienic or not hygienic. I mean, I don't want to go through them because I don't want to gross you out. But in the privacy context, we think that there should be clear standards, but it's much more difficult to write them. And this is why privacy policies are so long and so difficult to get through, because there just aren't clear standards. And even if there were some standards, who's writing those standards, and how do we trust that company to apply the standards properly? How do we trust the certification process? Who's running the certification process? So far, nobody has been able to make that work effectively.
The Federal Trade Commission in the U.S. is definitely on a long-term basis trying to grapple with this issue of what they can do. That's something I've been a part of here and there. And there's certainly a movement to try to make at least privacy policies easier for people to comprehend and make them more visually digestible. I don't think that solves the underlying problem, but it may at least help people navigate it a bit more. Ultimately, I think that there's just a false choice given to consumers, that everything is always presented in an all or nothing context. There's no negotiation. Some people would argue that the only solution to this is economic, that you need to have an ownership basis in your data. I'm not sure where I actually fall on that at this point personally. But certainly a part of my work has been in trying to improve the privacy policy regime and notice and consent, which I think is, and the FTC recognizes it too, that it's fundamentally broken, and what we have today absolutely does not work, and it does not work for consumers whatsoever. But the question is, how do we go forward? And I think the FTC also has been hesitant so far to come up with a solution because it's tricky. And, they have only kind of limited capacity. They don't have legislative capacity. They have rulemaking capacity. But at the FTC, it's actually fairly arcane for that agency. And so often it's let's get all the companies to play nice and agree to some level playing field. Self-regulation, as it's often called. And there's been a lot of kind of picking at this problem for a while, but I don't think we're super close to a solution yet. But there are a lot of us kind of grappling with it. And if anybody has anything they'd like to share with me afterwards, I'd love to hear it, because I'm always looking for new ideas in that area.
That's so much more hopeful than what I had to say.
So Michael and Reagan, if you can summarize, like, what would be the top actions that we could take as citizens in order to support better privacy policies?
We can demand more from the services that we use and the governments that we have to deal with, but also think small. So there are a lot of monopolies in the internet ICT service world, but there are also a lot of more privacy preserving companies out there that offer search engines, mail, that can be used, that do take it upon themselves to do their absolute best to encrypt all of the data and transfer, at rest, to collect less data. And that's really difficult, because we are, as Jennifer mentioned, in this kind of take it or leave it situation. So then the other option would be to try as much as possible to use these privacy-enhancing technologies, but use pseudonyms. And this is sometimes difficult on big platforms where you're actually not allowed to use pseudonyms. You have to use your real name so they can have verification of who you are in real life. And this again comes down to the issue of pushing companies to ensure that we can exercise our rights to anonymity and to pseudonymity and to control our data as much as possible. And the EU side, there will be this regulation that will pass soon. Apart from giving individuals, more control over their data, there's also a very, very hefty fine in it for violators of privacy laws. That is up to almost 5% of their annual turnover. So we're expecting to hopefully, if this law passes in the form, to see some changes in the companies and the big companies that do operate in the United States, but also in Europe and internationally, to also step up to the challenge and to adopt more privacy-preserving policies.
Yeah, on that note, I think there's a role for everyone, and that includes citizens, that includes governments, that includes corporations. There are there's that patchwork of laws. There's things like HIPAA, which protects health data in the U.S. There are ways of regulating or enforcing the security of information, of our information, in companies. But we need to have that economic incentive so that companies actually take it seriously. We need to have that social and political incentive that users won't take it anymore, or that they will use the plethora of other services that are out there that do try to protect your privacy, try to secure your communications, as Reagan said. And ultimately, I think the privacy issue is not about you and your data, it's about you and your community, the people that you interact with. And you need to make sure that that you keep in mind that even if you think that you don't mind sharing all of your information, that's also sharing other, like your friends' information, as we talked about on Facebook and others. And so you ultimately have to critically think about the type of information and communication and services that you use, and try to look, one step at a time, kind of move towards more privacy protecting services.
Great, thanks. So it sounds like, in summary, first awareness of these issues, and then the second, like acting upon, like thinking how could we improve our own practices in terms of privacy. Thank you so much. This has been an awesome discussion. And so we are wrapping up now. We will have a short coffee break, and we will be back soon with the second panel. Thank you.
Awesome.